Parish records can lead you in all sorts of directions, and because of my ongoing involvement with the research into the 1826 East Lancashire Weavers' Uprising, I have been logging data from an awful lot of parish registers for about 3 years now. The trouble is, when you are looking through them line by line, you can't help but spot the more unusual notes. The ones that you wouldn't have noticed in the first place if you weren't having to go through the document line by line. A while ago now, I was looking through the burial registers for St Leonard's Church in Langho, and a few of the entries really started to jump out. There were things in there that I hadn't expected to find. The 21st of August, 1780, Esther Taylor, Dr. Chews, Billington, insane. 28th of July, 1793, George Senhouse, Dr. Chews, Billington, insane. 22nd of March, 1801, Edmund Law, gentleman, bachelor, Dr. Chews, marasmus, we got a cause of death there, insane. The 25th of March, 1806, the Reverend John Craik, Dr. James Chews, Billington, rector of Grasmere in the county of Westmoreland, insane. These were just 4 of 33 burials between 1780 and 1811, all of which described people who were clearly suffering from some sort of unspecified psychological issues. And in the case of Edmund Law, who died of marasmus, malnutrition which is caused by not eating enough protein, carbohydrates or fats. There's not an awful lot of food left there, is there? Apart possibly from fruit and vegetables. Was that what he was eating? But there's a more intriguing question here. Who in the world was their host, Dr. James Chew? This is just too interesting. How to find out more? I went to the place I always look, the National Library of Scotland's Old Maps website. Highly recommended. And there I found the 1844 Ordnance Survey map for Billington and Langho, which makes things all the more intriguing. In 1844, not far from the now closed Petre Arms, there is a path leading across the other side of the Turnpike Road, the main road, to a group of buildings which were labelled Lunatic Asylum. And when I compared the map to a more modern equivalent, I realised that I was looking at the site of Mittenfold Hotel and Golf Club, where my secondary school leavers dance was held nearly 24 years ago. Knowing that bit of the Ribble Valley as well as I do, I know that Langho and Billington border each other. So all this information that I've found so far about Dr. Chew and his patient is starting to look plausible. Once I began to dig around in the Lancashire Archives catalogue, I found that there was quite a bit of material out there, and I have a strong suspicion that this will actually be the first in a series of videos. So where can we go today? Of all the places that William Alexander Abraham could have been born, he arrived in Lydiate in 1835. Lydiate, which is between Ormskirk and Liverpool. He was the son of an independent minister, and you may remember Lydiate. I've mentioned it before in the video that I made about the fire of 1894. hopefully there will be a link on the screen so you can go and find it if you so wish. The Abraham family later moved to Tockholes, not far from Blackburn, and as a young man, William became the librarian of Blackburn's Free Library. Besides writing a history of Blackburn, on the 6th of February 1873, he also supplied the Historical Society of Lancashire and Cheshire with a very handy, rather lengthy, 84-page study with a very worthy and very wordy title. Not the snappiest of titles, so I'll just call it A History of the Township of Billington if I need to for shorthand. And wouldn't you know it, in his history of the township of Billington, William Abraham talks about various branches of the Chew family. It turns out there are a few of them around there. It was understood that Cho, C-H-O, was originally a manor within Billington itself, and the family had taken their name from the manor. By 1562, so we're now into Queen Elizabeth I's reign, one family of Chews was linked to Potterford to the north of Billington, which is on the banks of the River Calder, and apparently Potterford farmhouse was old enough that it was rebuilt in 1610. Still exists today, and Historic England tells me that the inscription EC 1610 is inscribed on one of the fireplaces. That's quite intriguing. In fact, the 1844 Ordnance Survey map also backs this up. Pottersford House and stepping stones are by a bend in the river, slightly to the north of Chew Bank Wood. These chews are getting their name all over the map. There's also Chew Mill, a bobbin mill, and the Chew Mill Ford, which crosses the river. All of these are just under a mile north of where the asylum was, where Mittenfold Hotel is today. Elsewhere, Mr. Abraham talks about yet some other Chews. In 1687, Edward Chew, a gentleman of Billington, aged 50, gave a statement in some unspecified case to do with Langho Church, which would be St. Leonard's. Mr. Abraham comments, "It was, I conjecture, a son of this Edward Chew, also named Edward Chew, who built the house in Billington now known as the Asylum." In other words, the Lunatic Asylum had begun life as an ordinary residential house. But how can we be sure that it's the same house? I think William Abraham's notes are pretty compelling. This tenement stands close to the railroad, at the foot of the hill, on the south side of the township, and is reached from the Worley and Blackburn Road by an occupation road opposite the Petries Arms, which is exactly what it says on the Ordnance Survey map from the 1840s. Perhaps you noticed something slightly vague in William Abraham's words. It was, I conjecture, a son of this Edward Chew, also named Edward Chew, who built the house in Billington known as the Asylum. I conjecture. As a researcher, that is suggesting to me that Mr. Abraham had not actually been able to find any evidence to prove that link. He is just surmising that that's the case. And I can understand that. He is writing this book in the 1870s. He couldn't check dates on the internet. He couldn't even do a quick 5-minute search to find out where to find the original parish records to trace the Chew family. And if he had been able to find the parish records, maybe he would have had to go and visit various churches to do so. But I, living 150 years later, do have the internet. Can I prove what William Abraham could only guess at? On the 28th of January 1675, in the reign of Charles II, Edward Chew, the son of Edward from Potter Ford, was baptised at Great Harwood. 2 potential siblings were baptised in the far more logical location of Worley Parish Church, Anna in 1671 and James in 1672. Again, the family address is given as Potterford. So if their father is fathering children in the 1670s, he could well have been born in the 1640s, perhaps the late 1630s. 1637 or thereabouts is possible. There is no hint in the parish records that Edward, who was born in 1675, died in childhood. But there is a reference to Edward Chew, yeoman of Billington, in a property conveyance dated February 1723, which is held at the Lancashire Archives in Preston. Now, if that is the same Edward, that means he lived to be at least 48 years old. If he lived into his late 40s, there is a distinct possibility that he was fathering children 10 to 20 years earlier, perhaps even 5 years earlier. Perhaps he still had very small children. It's very possible. William Abraham then goes on to note the existence of a building close to Mittenfold, where there is a date stone which apparently reads EAC 1702. Now, this kind of format suggests that the structure, the building, was built by a married couple, Edward and Anne, or Alice Chew, for instance, maybe Agnes. And the date also ties in very neatly with various local parish records. Although Edward lived in Billington between 1703 and 1713, his elder children, Edward and Janet, were baptised at St Bartholomew's Church in Great Harwood in 1703 and 1705, which perhaps suggests a family connection to the town. Great Harwood is not really a great distance from Billington. It's really only over the other side of Worley now. A little further afield, but again, not too far away, 3 younger children, Abraham in 1708, Richard in 1711, and Elizabeth in 1713, appear in the baptism registers of St Mary the Virgin, the parish church of Blackburn. Ironically, the child who is actually critical to the next part of the story, at least if we are to believe Mr Abraham, James Chew, does not seem to have a surviving baptism record. But sometimes historical research is like that. You can't have everything all of the time. We can find out some things about him though. According to William Abraham, James Chew was buried on the 5th of July 1768 at the Old St Leonard's Church in Langho. And unlike his father, Dr James Chew did make a will on the 29th of June 1768, exactly a week before his own funeral. This was a very last-minute will, clearly. In fact, it's this will that gets us back to the link to the Lunatic Asylum. Because fortunately, James Chew describes himself as a surgeon, which sounds like the right man. Even more fortunately, he even bothered to give some very useful specific details about himself. Personally, I love a good historic will. They tell you so much that you didn't know that you wanted to know. A well-written one is an absolute joy. But if there's one thing that wills have taught me over the years, it's that they really do not have a standard format. They might begin, as Dr. James Chew did, with something about the testator's name, address, job or social status, depending on who they were. This is the last will and testament of James Chew of Billington in the county of Lancaster, surgeon. That's what he put. Convention usually required that they were signed by 2 or sometimes 3 witnesses. Dr. Chew opted for John Lancaster, Mary Bentley and John Parker, none of which seem to have been obviously related to him, and they do not seem to have been beneficiaries either. The witnesses shouldn't really be standing to gain from the will. But because they're often not mentioned in the document, it's not always easy to say how the testator knew them. So they could have been neighbours, friends, maybe they were tenants or servants even. What we do know in this particular case is that all 3 of them, John Lancaster, Mary Bentley and John Parker, were all able to sign the names. So they must all have been reasonably literate. As for the contents themselves, actually Dr. Chew put quite a bit of effort into this document. This is not one of those last minute back of an envelope type of wills. It seems to have been, if not necessarily written up by a legal clerk or a lawyer, it is full of the kind of phrases they would use. And I do hereby direct the rest and residue of my estate, and lots of my said son and my said daughter. Very, very typical standard 18th century legal jargon, and I think that I would guess a good 30 to 40% of the content of any will of that period is probably made up of these stock phrases that they used. But if you cut out the excess wording, if you pare it down to the important details, we learn a lot about our James Chew, who we think was about 54 years old at the time. He had land in quite a lot of places in the Ribble Valley, and also what is now known as the Hindburn area. There was a property called Dewhurst's in Bailey, near Hurst Green, it's just a bit out of Clitheroe. This went to his eldest son, Abraham, on condition that Abraham paid £900 to his siblings. He had a lot of siblings, we'll come to them later, within the year. There was also 2 shillings and 8pence in rental income from an estate in Dutton. That was also for Abraham. Separately, there is a messuage and tenement, so that's a bit of land with a dwelling of some kind on it, in Great Harwood, and a similar property in Billington, which is called Butlew. Both of these go to James, who is the youngest son. Yet another messuage and tenement in Billington, which is called Dobson's Tenement, rented from Lady Sturton, so he tells us, goes to James's son Thomas. And there does actually seem to be a bit of a local link here. I think he's talking about Catherine Walmsley, the daughter of Benjamin Walmsley of Duncanalsh, near Claytonley-Moors, so not so far from Great Harwood, who married Baron Petrie when she was 15, was widowed not long afterwards, and then remarried to Charles Lord Stourton in 1733. Catherine also lived another 50-something years, dying in 1785. She lived a long time. But the Petrie Arms, of course, was just opposite James Chew's property at what is now Mytton Fold, or at least it was by the 1840s. Alice, Dr. Chew's second daughter, aged 27 when her father died, got a wonderful legacy. My best bedding and furniture thereto belonging. Now, Alice wasn't married at the time when her father made his will, so maybe that was the idea. He thought it might be useful in the future for when she did get married, maybe she was planning to, or when she came to set up a home of her own. All this may lead us to suppose that the Chew family looked a bit like this in the late 1760s. That's only one part of the picture. When I began to dig into the parish registers, one or two extra connections emerged. The Chew family was a little more extensive than I first realised. 13 children with 2 wives. James's first wife, Anne, was buried at Langho on the same day that their son Edward was baptised, which strongly suggests a death in childbirth or from related complications. 9 years later, baby Richard, son of the second Mrs. Chew, who was another Anne, was baptised on Christmas Day, 1759. He was buried at Great Harwood 2 days later, and his mother's funeral followed on New Year's Eve, so she didn't survive childbirth for very long either. This also makes sense of an instruction that Dr. Chew put into his will. His executors had to invest any legacies for his underage children. Indeed, at the time of his death, only 3 out of 8 who were alive were actually over the age of 21. I'm going to discount his daughter Grace, because Grace seems to simply vanish from the local records. After her baptism, I simply cannot find her, so I don't know whether she moved away or whether she had her name misinterpreted somehow. Grace is a mystery. There is, however, overall, one really rather obvious omission in the will of Dr. James Chew. You would never guess that he had anything to do with the Lunatic Asylum at Billington. And in the next video, I'm going to move on to talk about his son Abraham, the eldest son from his first marriage, whose connection to the place was made much, much more explicit. Do look out for that in the near future.